everyone, and welcome back to this edition of the Business of Compliance podcast, where today we're honored to be joined by Babel AI founder, chief executive officer, Shea Brown. Shea, you're also heavily involved in the International Association of Algorithmic Auditors, a founder of that organization as well. You also lead in some capacity with For Humanity.
Yeah, I'm a fellow and a board member there.
So Shay, and for our listeners, Shay's perspective is one that we all need, not only for those that are heavily steeped in governance, risk, and compliance, but also for business leaders. Shay, I think your perspective really does offer value for anyone who chooses to participate in this dialogue with us today. That said, the dialogue, we talk a lot about kind of the micro forces associated with governance, risk, and compliance today, specifically around AI governance. And that is some of the frameworks that organizations can implement to begin building practical and useful AI governance programs inside their organizations. But Shay, honestly, I don't know that we do a really good job of helping organizations understand from a global perspective, from the macro level, why these things are so important. And so today, I hope we might talk a little bit about some of that stuff, kind of what's happening at the surface on the whole, as opposed to the deep dive that we normally take, as long as that works for you.
Yeah, I'm excited to dig in. Yeah, let's do it.
Awesome. And that said, digging in, I think today we're saying really three significant global perspectives on AI governance. We have the US's perspective, which differs fundamentally from the perspective of the EU and the EU member states. And then we also see China really from a nation state perspective driving a lot of what's hitting the market from a product perspective and a governance framework perspective. I don't know if you have an opinion or maybe comments on those three separate forces or paradigms.
Yeah, I think I mean, the first comment is like how striking it is, at least from the outside looking, how different the approaches seem to be.
Yes.
And China's a little bit of a wild card in the sense that the difference is a little bit different in kind, and the content of it is not super different than some of the elements of what US and EU are doing. It's just the level of control from the outside and the speed at which they can enforce some of these things. But in the US does really seem to be very focused, especially now with the administration change, but even before then, very focused on innovation and not hindering innovation. That's sort of like if you're thinking about the high level principle that they're operating under is that free markets are good and will lead to the right solution in the end. And I think that's just Europe, of course, is capitalistic as well, but the US really is focused on that. Do not hinder innovation. Innovation will eventually sort itself out in such a way that we're going to have better outcomes for everybody.
Yes.
And then Europe has a different approach, very much about fundamental rights and making sure that any new technology and AI is in that bucket big time is going to preserve fundamental human rights.
Yes.
And so I think that's the general picture. And I think if you look at the cultures, and I want to hear your thought on this, culturally, I think all three of these, well, it's not, maybe not, the US and Europe for sure. And I think you could argue also similarly for China that there's some elements of this and just with a different kind of a backdrop is that people are prioritized, and the rights of people are at the forefront. It's just that they think there's a different way of protecting those. And in the case of China, it's a really tight control is going to maximize benefit for everybody and that they're going to control everything very, very tightly centrally. In the US, it's the complete opposite where it's totally decentralized and that you don't want any control at all and that there are natural forces that will maximize human rights modulo the laws that currently exist, and then we have Europe, which is sort of a little bit in between, where this top down structure. That's kind of how I view the general breakdown.
Yeah, and I agree, Shay. I mean, I think as I look at it, it really is a matter of priorities. And with the US, to your point, we prioritize innovation. I think when I have conversations with business leaders in the EU to talk about regulation, I mean, there's a strong sense that what's prioritized are people, consumer protections. To your point, fundamental human rights is defined by the EU. And so I think just setting those priorities alone mean that we've all got different behaviors and are looking to produce different outcomes. My kids are really into Jurassic Park right now. And so I step back and ask myself the question, just because we can, should we? I think that was a fundamental question that was asked through all the movies and through both of the books. But I do see that there's an opportunity to marry the focuses of innovation and consumer protections into a singular view. I just don't think that we've been able to politically find a way to have those conversations and start acting upon it just yet.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. I think my take on it is if you look at the details of all of the policy proposals, all of the requirements, like in the EU and in the US, what you see, I mean, even with the recent executive order, several executive orders, one on sort of education and promoting AI education, the other on directing the government on how they should be procuring AI. They still focus on things like testing and evaluation, governance, safety. Like those things are still in there. It's just that they are not at the forefront and they're not hard requirements, let's say, across the economy.
Yes.
And if you look at the EU, it's all the same stuff. And I think that the basic core principles, the kind of things you talk about on this podcast, the kind of things that we talk about on other channels, is all common sense that everybody kind of agrees you should do. It's just the disagreement is on how draconian you want to be about forcing it.
That's it.
That's really, but I think if I, as a business owner, we have to operate in these economies. The approach to me feels like just focus on those foundational things that they all agree on. And even if it's not required in one place and it is required some other place, we agree on them because they're good. There's something good about implementing them. And I feel like that's my advice to business owners is like stick to the first principles that we do agree on, and good faith goes a long way.
Agree. I mean, I think about the virtues espoused by OECD, which I think most of us believe should be held true, held in regard. Democracy, fundamental human rights, and of course the third's escaping me now that we're recording our dialogue. A rule of law. I mean, all those things we just agree should be, again, held in regard, held in esteem. I think what I struggle with is that I have conversations with leaders on either side of the Atlantic. The problems really show themselves when we talk about how to get there, which, we said that we would keep this conversation high level, but to kind of go down a layer here, that's what I think is so important about having structured standards as it relates to AI governance and other practices that we do implement. But regardless of focus, regardless of what we think the number one priority is, we understand that standards are a mechanism to help us, that is, organizations, create positive outcomes consistently. And so, whether you think that positive outcome should be innovation at all costs or consumer protections at all costs, we still have this engine, this operating system that we can install that will help us do just that. And I think that gets lost in a lot of the higher level conversations about where should we focus.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, I see this a lot. Like we have a training program, and sort of a lot of people coming to that program who want to be professionals in this field. They are, and they're upskilling, and they see these sort of macro level political shifts, and they see you know, what feels like really consequential decisions about policy, and people hand wringing about whether Senlac is going to accept 42,001, and whether the executive order that Biden gave is going to be taken back by Trump. Those issues, what they want to know is, how is this going to affect businesses? That's the question I get so many times, and the answer is, from my experience, they're still doing what they're doing. The businesses know that this is just the landscape is changing, but the things that they need to do to have a good product, the things they need to do to build trust with their stakeholders, are all the same kind of things. And that's what standards and best practices are about. And I think what they're looking for is something to point to and say, we are doing what we're supposed to be doing. And here's an example of that. That could be ISO, it could be NIST, it could be some other, just OECD. In the early days, people were just literally pointing to the OECD guidelines, or the high level expert group in the EU before the act. They had their own guidelines. People are just looking for something to point to and say, this is something that more than just my company agrees on.
Yeah.
And I don't think that the other macro things in the end of the day will affect things too much for business. I mean, it will, but it's not the full constraint. The constraint is like what you do on the ground. That's the harder part. That's the more interesting part. And we have solutions for that.
We do. We do. And to your point, we see examples of organizations in the US where we clearly value innovation, less restriction, less regulation, that see the benefit and value of real AI governance and are choosing to lean into governance as a value creation mechanism for the organization. Conversely, in the EU, we see organizations that are, and this is going to sound dramatic, I don't mean for it to, because it's not necessarily something I have a strong opinion on, but organizations have this heavy burden of external regulation and obligation that are still very innovative and still very successful in their own regard because they've chosen to create internal governance and management systems that allow them to create, iterate, and continue to bring value to.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that it is about it's going to be much more about the attitude towards this. Like, I mean, there's so many companies and so many industries that are very heavily regulated, and for good reason, because
Sure.
there's safety issues, there are fundamental rights issues. Those industries thrive. Companies in those industries thrive, and they're better companies and worse companies, and there are winners and losers. It all still plays out, and people still build companies that are really valuable and create a lot of value for the public. And I think that this feeling of like AI as a startup ecosystem, it's like, I think there's this false sense of like, we have to protect this innovative market because AI is so important, and we can't impose any unnecessary burdens on them. And I feel like that's probably more reason. The importance of AI and what it's going to do for society is probably more reason to put burdens on these initial, because you can thrive under constraints. Constraints are a way of generating new ideas and innovating in value. And I think we shouldn't be afraid of that and this is me kind of giving a little bit of my opinion on this.
Sure.
I think that, and I don't agree totally with, like, let's say, I don't wholesale believe that the EU has the right approach at all. But I do think that protection of fundamental rights and having constraints on these systems and the companies that develop them will, in the long run, produce just as vibrant and probably a better and more robust business ecosystem than if we just them go totally unconstrained and then try to clean it up afterwards.
I totally agree, Shay. I mean, using the US as an example, two of our most profitable industries are also two of the most heavily regulated in financial services and healthcare. We see where there is potential for material harm, but real risk, to keep it in the context of conversations that a lot of our people are having. In those instances, free markets do need some sort of imposed boundary, some sort of imposed guidelines. And at least in those two verticals, it hasn't slowed growth, it hasn't slowed profitability, and it hasn't slowed innovation.
No, I mean, the sense of slowing it down. So this is the argument, though, that I think that a lot of people are making, is that what they're seeing is an existential race between great powers in some sense. A lot of this is centered around essentially a fear that AI, those who win, the famous Putin saying about, those who win with AI will, win the world. I don't even know what the quote is. It probably wasn't even him. But the basic idea is the societies and the countries that win with the AI race will be the ones that dominate the world and decide on the global kind of structure. And I think that's the way it's been framed. And that's perfect for people who want to have no constraints, because that framing says it's an existential risk. if you're going to slow our innovation because of regulations and what they view as kind of imagined harms, then our adversaries will catch up with us. That's the explicit argument against regulation here. And I don't think I'm not like arrogant enough to think that they're wrong about that 100%. But I
Probably
do
not.
have an instinct that the innovation that happens in AI that will change the way the power structures in the world don't rest on whether I can willy nilly hire somebody with AI or whether I can use AI in an unconstrained way to diagnose somebody's cancer. Right? These are businesses that are building AI to serve a particular purpose. That's not innovation per se. You can do R&D all you want, but like just deploying things in a high risk area unconstrained doesn't in general promote innovation. The innovation happens in labs. It happens with deliberate effort. And I think it's a false dichotomy that they're setting up in order to avoid regulation, basically.
Now, one thing that you do point out is a topic of serious concern, and I think that's the potential for the growing gap between the global north and the global south. I mean, as you do think about regulation, again, some of these kind of external forces that we've talked about have been driven around what are two global north entities versus one global south entity. I mean, do you see regulation becoming an impairment for global south continuing to evolve and to further enrich themselves? Or do you see this as a way that the global north can concentrate power and again make that gap wider than it already is?
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely not an expert in geopolitics, but I will say that, like, I mean, what you see is that when the North is more hesitant about exporting technology or hesitant about growing in certain areas, you see China stepping in. Like, you look at it, who builds all the cell phones that are in Africa and South America?
Yeah.
It's China comes in, who's willing to build infrastructure and invest in those places. It tends to be China.
Yeah.
And is that about the regulation? I don't know. I have a feeling it's much more about the overall political paradigm and the philosophy around how expansion is going to happen and how power gets distributed across the world. And I think, but it is. I mean, there is a worry that there is going to be a concentration of power, and there already is, and it's just going to get worse with AI. And so this gets into questions of open source versus closed source, which is a debate. And we've seen a shift in the US where open source has become much more favorable. That benefits disadvantages incumbents. That benefits potentially people in the global south who want the opportunity to participate in that innovation, but don't necessarily have the resources to get the ball rolling. And
Yes.
so I don't know how it's going to play out, but it definitely is part of that paradigm.
And I do think the open source conversation is an interesting one, but because we've seen it for years with software, with operating systems. I mean, you name it, we see strong strongholds, if you will, around deployment of open source technology. We also see real fear and real concern over use of open source technology. So I think it'll be interesting to see what happens, especially with the U.S. taking the position that we will lean more on open source technologies. Yeah, I think that's going to be really, really interesting, as I said, over
Well,
the next couple of years.
I'm curious to hear your take on this as a cyber and information security professional. Like, how does this change? Because this has real implications. Just like open source, vulnerabilities in open source technologies are a vector for information security, for hacks. How does open source AI play into this?
Jay, and I mean, it's all the conversations we have today. As you consider securing the systems that are delivering AI and then securing AI. I mean, adversarial machine learning is a really, really, it's a focus area, maybe is the best way to put it. And we're seeing a lot of really interesting and scary things emerge from this field of AML. But with open source, I mean, it's always been the concern around these packages, these deployments do have inherent flaws and weaknesses, inherent vulnerabilities. And as organizations have an opportunity to tweak those fundamental packages, to meet their own specific needs, it almost fans out to become something that is too big a problem to actually solve once we deploy into production.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, it's scary. I mean, as somebody who thinks about this, the ethical implications of the various risks that happen, like this is one that I feel like we don't have, and the community doesn't have a super tight grasp on how that's actually going to play out. Because there's just it's not like a piece of code. These models are not like a piece of code where you can try to figure out a pattern of a vulnerability and find it. It's the density of these like large language models where it's like you can't see the patterns in those weights, and it's like inserting a human that has an agenda inside a system that you don't know when that agenda is going to play out under what circumstance.
right.
And it's a scary prospect.
It certainly is. I read an example the other day about, and I don't think it was Hugging Face, but it was another repository where some code had been made available. An organization downloaded it, deployed it. Built into the code were several back doors. As soon as the platform went live, the bad actors had an open door to walk in and do whatever they wanted to do. I mean, the examples of areas that we should be concerned about are unlimited. They just aren't. And to your point, the community as of yet, because it is such a big problem, it's such a complex thing. Yeah, I don't know that we have a good answer for it. I really don't.
Yeah, the agent question, that's another, you know,
Talk about this, dude. I think this is a big one for a lot of our listeners.
yeah, I mean the thing with agents is that you well, I mean it's in the name agency, like you're giving software, and of course this has happened in other software contexts where you have automations that will execute things automatically. And that's the power of software, that you can have things running and you're not watching them,
Mhm.
and it's just that with agents, you have this inherent uncertainty where you don't necessarily know when or why it makes a decision. And at Babel, we've been really digging into trying to really understand this. And, in some sense, my understanding of these agents, I've worked with AI for a really long time. My
Yeah.
naive understanding was like, okay, so they have this orchestration layer. You have a large language model, and you're going to basically just be pinging this large language model to do things. And that made total sense. And you set it up so that it has loops and it will do things until it gets a better result. It felt totally natural. And my assumption was that like this orchestration layer, a big part of it was going to be the sort of like logical checks for things. And there are elements of that. Like when should I do this? If this, then that, right? The very classic sort of conditional architecture, right? And the more I dug into like how the most agents are actually deployed and work, it turns out that the LLM itself typically makes all those decisions. So in the military context, for instance, like let's just imagine I have an agent which is meant to gather information about a particular region or something like that. The cartoonist version of this is that it can decide whether it's going to deploy a drone to go take some photos, whether it's going to, in this context, get a satellite image, whether it's going to deploy something that could have, kinetic capabilities, let's say. It turns out really in the current way that these agents work, the LLM is the one that decides when it really makes that decision. It's like if you break it down, it's spitting out text, and at some point that text has the formatting of use this tool. It really is decided inside the large language model.
The input to the agent itself.
The agent itself. So if I have an agent that has tool capabilities, which is like deploy a drone, use a calculator, look at Google Maps,
Drop a bomb. Yeah.
drop a bomb, whatever, and it has the way it's set up is that it has these tools that's available to it. And normally the only way it knows that is through prompts. And you tell it, if you think that you should deploy a drone, structure the output in this way. What are the coordinates the drone should go to? When should it go? Blah, blah, blah. And so you could be interacting with this agent could be interacting with the world. And at some point, it decides to structure its output in a way that says, go deploy this drone. That is, I think most people that I've talked to, even in all of these different high risk domains, don't actually realize that it's not somebody saying this is the condition. It's the LLM just starts spitting it out. And that's terrifying.
And for our viewers, what's alarming about this is as we think about agent, some of you have done programming in the past and you're familiar with an IPO chart, input, processing, output. So we've kind of got those three things. So at its fundamental unit, an agent is really just a package that has, say, sensor, actuator,
Yep.
and some sort of function.
Yep.
And we have a sensor for input, what we call those percepts. We've got some sort of function or something that happens based on that input. And then we've got actuators to interact with the real world to affect a change in the environment. And so thinking about that very, very simple model, the idea is through the program and then the function itself, we can control what decisions these agents are making based on the input. But Shay, what you're saying is that that input can be so variable that it's almost like we hack the agent to have the agent do something that we didn't necessarily intend for it to be performing.
Yeah. It really, we're trusting in most of the architectures. Now, of course, people who are good engineers are going to have different checks and guardrails and all of that, right? To check to make sure that it was appropriate to use your credit card to buy this thing, right? Or something like that. Or there'll be a human in the loop at some point. But if you mess that up and don't have it, there really is very little, like it just decides to use a tool. And that tool could be to use your credit card to do something. That tool could be to wipe a database and replace it with values it thinks are important. Like you really have to be careful about it's like having a whole nother agent, like another human inside your system that can have tools to affect the system. And the reason this came to me as a worry, and I'll just say this last bit was when I was building a website to interact with my courses, and I had an agent that was helping me build this interface, and I was connecting it with the courses that we have with all the students' information and all of my course content and all this stuff. And I gave it the API key so that it could do things. And as soon as I did, I realized I don't actually understand what's going on. This is an agent that had no transparency. It was just some tool to build a website. And I just realized it now has my API key. It could erase all my students' data. Immediately was like, okay, I have to understand exactly how it's making decisions on my behalf.
Jay, I think that's a very good point to iterate for our listeners as we do think about agents. You mentioned the potential for single one-off issues, mistakes. For listeners, remember the utility of AI and the utility of agents in particular is that we can automate change at scale. And so potentially a bad decision can be implemented and automated across an entire organization, potentially across the entire world. I mean, these are very, very real things with very real potential for harmful impacts, which is why it's of such concern. And Shay, I know we're out of time. I cannot believe we've covered our time so quickly. But just to bring this back to kind of where we started, and that is to say, globally, there are a lot of different ideas, a lot of different philosophies about what the right priorities are, regardless of what those priorities are based on where you live, where you sit, or what your philosophical ideology is. Practically, there are some things that we can be doing today as individuals and organizations to prepare ourselves to develop and use AI responsibly. And those things really center around selecting and implementing a known good standard, a known good framework for AI development in your organization. I think that's very, very important for all of our listeners to hear. Shay,
Absolutely. No, I just second that. And I think, there are plenty to choose from. Actually, not really. There are very few to choose from. Uh,
here's you to choose from today.
and I'd say ISO 42001 is the most sensible one. Uh, or NIST AI risk management framework. They have served very different purposes, but they can be complementary. But beyond that, there's not a ton of consensus. But I think one of those two or both is kind of the best starting point.
Hey, Brown, thank you so much for your time today. Hopefully, we can continue this conversation at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Of course. And to our listeners, thank you again for joining us. Please let us know if you need anything at all. Shay, thank you. We'll talk again soon.
Thank you.